Remember when the Liberals and the NDP started coming out about 2 years ago with this narrative that if we somehow achieved, quote, social license through things like carbon taxes, that all of a sudden pipelines would be built in Canada? I think a lot of people listened to that and thought, okay, let's see what this is all about. So since that point in time, since they started saying, well, all we need to do is put in place a bunch of really punitive taxes and regulations in Canada, that we'd see a bunch of pipelines built. What's really happened? Well, the reality is we've seen most major energy companies or energy infrastructure companies say, look, Canada's really not a market that we want to be in right now because of the political instability that's brought into place by the Liberals. So the most recent example of this happened last week in Parliament when the Industry Association for Pipelines in Canada went before committee and said this. They said very bluntly, they said there are going to be no new pipelines built in Canada under the changes that the Liberals have made to the regulatory environment. And they went a little bit further. Now, I have to say, this surprised me a little bit because Canada's energy industry and their associations they've kind of taken appeasement tactics with both the NDP and the Liberals in recent years. I think that they thought for a while that these leftists could be negotiated with. And it was encouraging to see them finally see the light and just put it very bluntly that nobody's going to build pipelines in Canada under these governments. So I wanted to explore this a little bit for you when you're talking to your friends, you have a little bit of information. So Catherine McKenna, the Environment Minister, she is sort of propaganda artist #1 on this social license with carbon tax equals pipeline falsehood. So the Liberals, under her leadership, has put in place a $40 a megaton price on carbon, or a carbon tax in Canada. And when they first announced this carbon tax, they used the analogy of, hey, if there's or the rationale that if this comes into place, that there will be pipelines built, and also that greenhouse gas emissions would reduce. Now, for the last year and a half, we've been asking, okay, well, how much will greenhouse gas emissions actually be reduced at $40 a megaton in Canada? And they can't answer that. And why can't they answer that? Because it's not really going to reduce demand in Canada. I haven't seen any data that shows that greenhouse gas emissions are going to be lowered to their targets at $40 a megaton. So this is really a tax that is just a tax. It's a tax that's a cash grab. It's not going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But what it did do was it made things worse for building out energy infrastructure. So, certainly McKenna might see a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, but it's because the economy has suffered for it. And to me, if you are going to look at greenhouse gas emission policy, it should be such that you see a reduction in greenhouse gas emission while your economy grows. If you've put in place punitive policies that actually reduce your economic growth at the same time, that's probably bad public policy. But back to the question, did this carbon tax actually help pipelines get built in Canada? And the answer squarely is no. I mean, look at all the fails that the Liberals have had this year. So the Industry Association sitting before committee being honest and basically saying, we're not even going to try and negotiate with you anymore because we know that you're not going to actually build out any sort of infrastructure, I think is a wake-up call for all of us. So, where do we go from here? My leader, Andrew Scheer, the leader of the Conservative Party, has said one of the first things that he would do as Prime Minister of the country is to repeal the carbon tax. Because, if you're looking at environmental policy, there are numerous other ways that we could look at in Canada that would potentially reduce greenhouse gas emissions without stealing money from you for no reason. There were many things that we did in our previous Conservative government. I'm thinking about things like we had a sector-by-sector regulatory approach that reduced greenhouse gas emissions in your cars. We put in place regulations on the coal-fired electricity sector. But the goal, and we had a lot of other programs related to energy efficiency, these sorts of things. But the goal was to reduce greenhouse gas emissions without making us uncompetitive in the North American marketplace, because we see the Americans lowering taxes and making their regulatory environment a lot simpler, but to make sure that the economy grew at the same time. And what the Liberals don't realize is that Canada produces some of the most environmentally sustainable oil in the world, in that it's subject to some of the strictest regulatory reviews in the world. It's subject to, I think about some of the things that we put in place in our Conservative government around transport regulations and tanker traffic and pipeline inspections, and I could go on and on and on. So why wouldn't we develop that resource? And then, if you want to take on the Liberal narrative of, okay, well, we believe that these jobs are dirty. I don't, but for the sake of argument, you still need to transition to a different economy. It's like you can't just kill an industry and expect the country to continue to function in terms of the revenue that this industry produces for social programs and frankly for jobs. I'm a Calgary MP. I represent a riding in Calgary. Many of my constituents, were very gainfully employed prior to the Liberals coming into office, but this regulatory uncertainty that they've put in place has forced a lot of people out of work. It's not just Calgary though, right? Trudeau's been taking pictures in steel factories saying, oh, we need to support our steel workers. Well, guess where steel goes? Into pipelines. Wouldn't it be great if we had some pipelines built in Canada to support our steel industry? And that brings me to my next point, which is, Trudeau is the worst for divisive regional politics. I remember being in Stephen Harper's cabinet, and one of the key goals that we had in any cabinet decision was to make sure that we were making national policy, right? You're looking at every region of the country and saying, how do we ensure that public policy that we're developing helps every region of the country rather than divides it? So when I see Justin Trudeau stand up and say, oh, we're going to spend all of this deficit funding on Bombardier, and for those of you who are watching from the US or other places, this is a aerospace manufacturer in a different part of the country that has been notoriously unprofitable, but that the government wants to put a lot of money into. So they wax eloquent about Bombardier and more about Bombardier and Bombardier and Bombardier, while major industrial segments of the economy are suffering because of their detrimental policies related to the energy sector. And people are noticing this. They're noticing this hypocrisy. So where do we go from here? I mean, I was encouraged to see Catherine McKenna on Evan Solomon's show. Evan Solomon is a television host here in Canada, and she appeared, I think it was yesterday, and he asked her, she had made this comment, I don't have time for people who, I think it was question my climate change policies or something like that. And he said, well, what about debate, right? Where do we have debate on public policy? And it was so interesting to watch, these Liberals, they've never been challenged or questioned before by the media, and that's starting to happen, right? So that's a good thing. But again, we have to start having a better public policy conversation that's more than just this virtue signaling that we see out of the Liberal government. I mean, you can't manage to photo ops at international climate change conferences. You actually have to put in place policy that's going to work. And, while there would be many people that would just lose their minds that I'm having this conversation, I could have a debate on the policies that our government put in place. You can actually see a reduction in emissions when we were in office, but the economy continued to grow. And yeah, sure, there are ways that we can do that, but putting in place a $40 a megaton carbon tax that is not going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, that is, as the Industry Association just said, going to severely hurt the possibility of pipelines being built in Canada. I don't know, that seems like bad public policy to me. And again, it's this holier than thou virtue signaling public policy focus, if you want to call it that, as opposed to putting something together that actually makes sense and creates jobs. And there's a human face to this question, and that is there are, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in this country whose livelihoods and or access to social programs depends upon the energy sector and its sustainable development. I mean, when I think about the price differential, and for those of you who aren't aware, because Canada, our energy products mostly go to the United States, we don't really get a world price for our energy products. We actually sell them at a discount. Just by having greater market access onto the global stage, just by doing that, we could have more revenue for our social programs, we could have more jobs. And this is why, the sustainable development of energy infrastructure is so important. So when I see Justin Trudeau, putting in place more barriers to the development of these projects that don't make any sense and don't make them more environmentally sustainable, when I see him refusing to get involved in this, this trade war between BC and Alberta, what is he managing to? He's not making the tough decisions or the tough choices to build the Canadian economy. What he's doing is he's managing to his own ego and to photo ops and trying to please everybody. You can't please everybody all the time, but you can come up with good public policy that's right for the country and explain why you're doing that. And he's failed to do that to date. So, regardless of where you're at on the pipeline conversation, Canada is one of the few countries in the world that already has such a strong environmental regulatory framework that we can develop these projects in an environmentally sustainable way that creates jobs and economic growth for the whole country. What Trudeau's done is taken that debate away, and I think he's just imposing an ideological imperative that was instilled in him by his father, which is, we don't want the energy sector to be productive in Canada. I mean, really, they do want to shut it down. In some ways, at least the NDP are more honest. I remember sitting on a panel with Linda McQuaig, this NDP candidate, during the last election campaign. She said, oil should stay in the ground. I wish Trudeau was just honest about it, because that's what his policies are doing, and certainly the Industry Association said that this week. So I'm glad that Canadians are waking up to this. I'm glad that the Industry Association found their moral fortitude and started pushing back on this and realizing, look, you can't appease people who are ideologically opposed to the development of the energy sector. I look at some of the senior people that they have in their staff. I think the chief of staff to the environment minister was like a CEO for the Pembina Institute or something like that. And for those of you who don't know what that is, it's a environmental NGO that is fundamentally opposed to the development of the energy sector. I think that there's a similar story for senior staffers in the natural resources industry. Like, where's just be honest about it, right? Anyway, just wanted to make sure that you were aware of this. If you have not read this testimony, I'll post a link to it on my Twitter page, but it's really damning. And it's, if you're in the energy sector right now, your industry association has basically said, can't do it under Trudeau. So at least we're calling a spade now. Anyway, about to head into the office to try and push back on some of this crazy stuff, as I'm wont to do, but working hard for you in Calgary. Have a great day.